what is the best and the worst thing about being a Sri Lankan?
That's a good question. I mean, I met Anita Pratap in Kerala 3 weeks ago, and yeah, I had to really fanboy her because she was such an influence. She interviewed Prabhakaran, interviewed Mahathir, and all the presidents of Sri Lanka, and I used her, and she was quite young, and she was there in '83 and '89. So those resources and all her interviews and her insights were quite valuable. But yeah, you're right, there's been a lot of culture. I mean, we were discussing before about how similar Kerala and Sri Lanka is. The landscape, when I come here, I see, yeah, the coconut
Even you
trees
said the
and
languages
rivers.
sound similar. I mean,
Yeah,
it
so in
sounds,
that last session, they was talking about Stri Purusha, which is male, female, Avasana, final. So these are, so I can recognize the language also similarities, and certainly the food.
food, even the
Pittu and
climate-wise.
India Appam, yeah. And so I think, yeah, lots of similarities there. Sri Lanka is a beautiful place, and it's still a beautiful place despite all this turmoil, and it's a wonderful place to live and write as is Kerala. But it's also run by idiots and savages, and we have squandered every opportunity. So I live there. I enjoy living there. I find it an inspiring place as a writer, but I'm also filled with profound disappointment. All through my life, I've seen the destruction we brought on each other. So I don't know. I guess it is a paradise on one hand, but it's also can turn itself into hell. It's got those. So I guess for a writer, these are great resources. You've got heaven and hell in one place to write about. But I'd rather a peaceful country where it wasn't so interesting. But yeah, you take what you can get. Yeah, like I say, you don't. No one chooses where they are born. Yeah.
And you also talk about this Sri Lankan bubble or the cinnamon crowd. I remember visiting Colombo and staying at Cinnamon maybe 2-3 years before it was attacked. So I was going gaga about this place, the great food, the cleanliness, the beauty of the land. But you are saying that there is this thing called the cinnamon crowd or this guild. And you say that you were lucky enough or privileged to be removed from the war or such things.
Well, so Colombo seems to function like it's almost another country, and so I grew up, since '83. I was a child in '83, and I grew up with this terrible war that raged for 30 years. But Colombo carried on regardless. It was, we had checkpoints, we had bomb blasts and assassinations and curfews, but even now, December, we are in a grave economic crisis and the country's been brought to its knees. But Colombo in December was partying. The lights were on for Christmas. The tourists were back, and we're supposed to have electricity crisis, but yeah, the Christmas lights were on, and it seems like Colombo has I guess it's a coping mechanism as well, especially during the war. So I grew up feeling that the war, you see it on, the newspaper. Front page, you have the death count. Back page, you have the cricket score. And we sort of distract ourselves with, cricket and parties and the Colombo bubble. And it's almost like the war is happening in another country, even though it's a short bus ride away. And I suppose in the book, I guess in both books, the first book, I wanted to write a story set in Sri Lanka in the 90s that did not mention the war at all. And that was what Chinaman was. It was about two old men who just watch cricket and drink arak. And that's all they do. And the war is there in the background. But they live in that bubble. They know there's nothing they can do about the war. And we all felt the war would go on forever. So you get on with life. And with Mali Almeida, he was very conscious of the fact that he was a middle-class, privileged guy, and he was moving in these circles where people were having parties while there were atrocities happening. But he felt the guilt, and I guess I also grew up with the guilt, knowing that people my age, who had grown up in Jaffna, in Trincomalee, in Batticaloa, or in the Deep South, had a much more harrowing experience, whereas we were sheltered from it. So, I didn't do much with my guilt apart from 30 years later write a novel about it. But Mali Almeida was, I suppose, my projection of someone who was a bit more idealistic, a bit more adventurous, and a bit more moral. He felt it was his duty as a Sri Lankan to go, because he had this talent for photography, to go to these dangerous places and take photographs, because he felt somewhat naively that it's because Colombo doesn't know what's happening. we just know what the papers feed us. But if I took photographs and exposed all the atrocities of the war might end. But of course, in the story, he pays for that with his life. So I've been very conscious of the fact that Colombo seems to, even now, we're still, I mean, the petrol queues have stopped, there's still inflation, the shortages have stopped. But today is Sri Lanka's Independence Day, and yeah, they're spending 200 million on Independence Day celebrations, when they should be giving that to the poor. They should be buying medicines and all of that. So there's a lot of controversy happening as we speak. And it just seems that that's also part of the Colombo bubble. Colombo's going to pretend that 75 years of independence and have big pomp and ceremony, while the rest of the country is suffering. So that was the theme, I guess, in both books. And I guess it comes from my own guilt of having grown up in that bubble, virtually unscathed by all this trauma.
And in Seven Moons, you say that Sri Lankans are silent seekers. And Mali Almeida decided to voice his concern. He was loud. So that could be one reason he was killed, why he was killed. So are you saying that it's better to be quiet and not to respond, not to voice your concerns? What is, I mean, as a writer, as a human being, what are we supposed to do?
So this is what Sri Lanka grapples with. I've spoken before, people ask me about freedom of speech, which seems to be something that they take for granted in the West. We don't take that for granted because, so 89 when I'm writing about, a lot of journalists and activists and those who spoke up against how things were running were silenced, were disappeared and killed. And we had that period again right out, just before the war ended and after that. Iconic newspaper editor Lasantha Wickramatunge was gunned down in broad daylight. So many other journalists were disappeared or are in exile. And so this idea of speaking up, I mean, thankfully there are a lot of brave people who do it, but it's not the most advisable thing because like Mali Almeida, you end up either disappeared or dead or tortured. But what was strange though, I found in the last year, the fact that the whole nation got on the street and were shouting, not just speaking up, they were shouting obscenities at the people in power, also online, on Twitter. Every time a politician tried to placate the public saying, don't worry, the economic crisis is not as bad as everyone says, everyone would pile on and just mock them and insult them. So it's a strange thing that 10 years ago, the people we feared, we were now emboldened. And I think perhaps it was because we enjoyed a brief period of freedom of press from 2015 to 2019 before the Easter attacks. And also maybe the proliferation of social media that allows people to express that. But it's something that I grapple with as well. I'm certainly not an activist or a political commentator, and even though they try to drag me into these things, I maintain that I'm just a genre novelist. I just write detective stories about cricket and ghost stories about dead men solving their own murder. And I think that's true, and I want to keep that position that writing, so I feel I can hide behind fiction, and also I write about things that happened 20 years ago. But the question is, for Sri Lankans, do we speak up? Or do we look after our safety?
You said about the self-censoring. You do that.
Well, you have to think it's just a story you're writing. Is this, and I've got young kids, I've got a family, is this story worth getting beaten up or becoming a person of interest or suddenly having all sorts of people turning up at your house? And you weigh it up and you think, no, I'm just going to write a silly story about. So I do look very carefully, even though the books do talk about controversial subjects, I suppose, about religion and politics and so on. I guess because I'm hiding behind a narrator, because Mali Almeida is nothing like me, neither is W.G. Karunasena, neither are the characters in the short stories. So by hiding behind a narrator, I hope that I can get away with saying that this is fiction, this is just a story which happens to be set in Sri Lanka. And if I'm being truthful and authentic about Sri Lanka, I need to engage with the politics and the atrocities that have happened. But yes, it's a constant concern. You're not free to say whatever you want, and you have to be very careful about how you go about it. And currently, even though we had this Aragalaya where we ousted a president and dismantled a government, now we're seeing voices being silenced. Now, when people try to gather, they'll get arrested on flimsy charges, and So it seems like that era is starting up again. So you have to navigate it very carefully. And I still maintain I'm not a hero. I don't think a book is worth getting beaten up or stabbed over. And so you navigate that in your own way. But there are a lot of people braver than me who are out there still on the streets, on social media, voicing their discontent. So I think it's up to the individual to choose which path they want to take.
In that short story, Ceylon Islands, from the collection Birth Lottery, you have written that if first create violence, then add religion to that. And that is happening. We can, as Indians, we can easily relate to that. I think that's happening all over the world. That's an easiest method for them to propagate violence when you add religion to that.
So Ceylon Islands from the Birth Lottery, that's like one of my favorite stories. I don't think many other people are impressed by it, but I kind of like the idea. The idea was, because I found out there's about 1 million Sri Lankans who have fled Sri Lanka for various reasons. The burghers left in the 50s and 60s when it was made Sinhala only. Then many of the Tamils had to leave because of the war, and then Muslims were persecuted recently, and now you're finding economic refugees of every stripe. You're seeing, you go to the passport office, it's like the opening scene of Mali Almeida. People are lining up, and one of our great folk singers, Sunil Pereira, who passed away from COVID, he remarked, he said, why are we running away from this paradise? People should be getting in box, trying to clamor to get into this country. But somehow we're driving our people away and everyone's going away. And so this idea was, what if the diaspora of Sri Lankans formed a separate country? What would that country look like? So I weave the story of the Ceylon Islands, where all the migrants suddenly come back here and they create this idyllic Sri Lanka, which takes all our good points and creates this paradise. But it's also, I don't want to give too much away of the story, but it's told from the point of view of a terrorist who is trying to dismantle the Ceylon Islands because, for whatever reason, you find out. And he says the easiest way to do that is to add religion, add religious division, because one of the stipulations of the Ceylon Islands, according to the story, was to become a citizen, you have to trade in your Sri Lankan passport and trade in your race and your religion. You can't call yourself Sinhala, Tamil or Muslim, or you can have your religion private, but you have to be a citizen of the Ceylon Islands. And this is a very simple idea that, even our children can get it, but it seems that we've been unable to as a nation, the idea that we consider ourselves Sri Lankan first. And okay, we're Sri Lankans and we speak Tamil and Sinhala and English, we believe in different things or don't believe in different things, but we're all still Sri Lankan. But I think also now we're having an election coming up. Every time elections come up, these are the easy ways to win votes. You start bringing up these minorities out to get us. These guys want a separate state. If you want to keep the country safe, vote for the majority. And so this stuff, but I don't think Sri Lanka at a basic cellular level is racist or homophobic or bigoted. If you look at, you visited Sri Lanka and you see the Tamils and Sinhalese living together, speaking each other's languages, and it's fine, but I think these ideas it's easy ways to win elections. And it's been our story since 1958 when we made it Sinhala only. So I think that's why but my hope is, because we saw the Aragalaya this time, and these kids who were protesting didn't seem to be shackled by these archaic ideas. They were, represented across all genders, and there was a pride parade, which I've never seen in my entire life there. And all the races were together across generations, and it was a wonderful moment of unity. So it proves that we can unify. If only supporting the cricket team or at these Aragalas, we can get together. But it seems it's easy to plant these seeds of division in order to win power in elections.
Now, speaking of Mali Almeida, the protagonist of the book 7 Moons of Mali Almeida, in the first chapter itself, it's revealed that he is a dead man. He's a ghost. And he meets this boy in that interim state who calls him Ponneya. I hope that's how it's pronounced.
Ponneya.
Ponneya.
Yeah.
I think it's a derogatory term for homosexual, and it could also imply impotence. So why did you create such a character who openly says that he calls himself as a photographer and a slut, and he's a closeted gay? So why did you create such a character, and why is this novel set in 89? 89, I guess, when the war was going on.
Well, I'll answer the last bit first. The initial seed of the idea was I wanted to write a ghost story because I was tired of writing about cricket, so I wanted to do something completely different. And I thought, what if the dead of the victims of Sri Lanka's many conflicts could speak? Because already we make myths. The Easter attacks, which happened in 2019, not that long ago, it's forgotten. It's a distant memory because now we have fresh crises to deal with. But there were many narratives around the Easter attacks, where it came from, how it suddenly, we had this extremism and it disappeared after a month, who was behind it, who funded it. But those narratives disappeared. And I just thought, and this is the case with all the massacres and all the killings, all the phases of the war, the narrative keeps getting changed or it gets forgotten. And I thought, what if the dead were allowed to speak? So that was my concept for the story. And the obvious place to write about would have been 2009, the final phase of the war, where tens of thousands of civilians died. Initially, the state denied that anyone had died, said it was only terrorists that died, but you can't, the numbers were overwhelming. And again, there was a debate about who were these people, whose fault it was. And I thought, okay, if those dead people could speak, what would they say about Sri Lanka and what it has done to them? But that would have been dangerous, back to the freedom of speech. If I was like criticizing the end of the war, even if I do it now, I think I could be in trouble. So I thought, okay, I can take this concept, and sadly Sri Lanka has many atrocities to choose from. So then I remember 89. I was a teenager then, and I remember how it was. We had 3 separate wars. We had the separatist war with the Tamil Tigers, the JVP, Marxist insurrection in the south, the government death squads, the SDF who were assassinating suspected terrorists, and the Indian peacekeeping force, which had boots on the ground. And I just thought that was a fascinating period, and I didn't quite understand it when I lived through it. So that's why I set it there. The character of Mali Almeida, I don't know how characters evolve. You start with an idea. I knew that he was a war photographer who had seen many horrible things that he had documented and kept under his bed, but then different aspects of his character emerged. The fact that he was a gambler, that money was meaningless to him, and that he didn't even feel like spending the money he earned on this, and also he saw life as a gamble. He was an atheist. He was convinced that there can't be a God or a cosmic plan to all of this, because what he'd seen on the battlefield convinced him of that, and then he wakes up in the afterlife to find out that there is a system and all that. So I think that was the absurdity of it. But then him being a closet gay man, I think that detail came from Richard de Soisa, who was a murdered activist in 89, a middle-class Colombo boy who, he wasn't a war photographer or a gambler, but he was an activist and a theater person. But he was a closet gay man, and I used him as a starting point, but Mali Almeida evolved into his own persona, but this aspect stayed. It just felt more real that he was a man of many secrets. And also in 1989, what other type of gay man could you be in Sri Lanka or most parts of the world? You had to, especially in Colombo society, he had to keep his identity secret. So it made sense why he would go to these dangerous places, because in the war zone, he could express himself freely sexually and be who he wanted to be. So I think that's how all these details came together. I didn't like sit down and say, I want to write from the point of view of a gay man, because that's a terribly difficult and dangerous thing to attempt. But that just seemed how his character evolved, and it made sense also with his relationships and his view of the world.
Now coming to Chinaman, there is this line where you are saying, if you are not familiar with cricket, if you don't know anything about cricket, if you have not watched one single match, this book is for you. And I actually Googled for Pradeep Matthew, thinking that it's a real character. So how...
You saw him online, no? He exists, yeah. Yeah.
So,
because a few years after the novel came out, we had a guy called Angelo Matthews, and we had a guy called Nuwan Pradeep. And they opened the bowling for Sri Lanka, and it had Pradeep and Matthew opening the bowling. And people were sending me screenshots. I said, yeah, I predicted it. And then there was a match-fixing scandal close after that. closely resemble the match fixing scandal in Chinaman. So maybe Pradeep Matthew is real, who knows?
I know cricket is one area of interest for you, like music. So how did you get this inspiration to write your first book on cricket? And of course, there is Sri Lankan politics as the backdrop.
So I tried writing different, I won't say novels, stories, and so on in my 20s. And coming up with ideas, I don't think that's difficult. I think everyone has an idea for a novel or a screenplay or or a play or a video game. Everyone's got ideas. But then once you have the initial idea, sitting down and writing the next 200 pages, that's where we falter. And I always faltered with research. Okay, I want to write a war story about Sri Lanka. Then I said, oh no, I've got to now research the war. So this idea was, what if the greatest cricketer had played for Sri Lanka in '85 and therefore nobody noticed him? Seemed an intriguing idea. And I realized that all I had to do was watch cricket matches and hang out with drunk old men and talk about cricket. And so that's what inspired me.
You actually did that for 2 years. I mean, I've read that. You just watched cricket.
No, so the period was 82 to 99. And I'm not a huge cricket fan. I mean, I was, sorry, I was young in 1996. So I was swept up with that fairy tale because in the midst of the war, we won a World Cup and suddenly we thought the country is invincible, there's nothing we can't do. And we had a golden age of cricket, I'd say for the next 10 years after that. But I specifically was looking at Pradeep Matthew's career, 82 to 99. So I just watched, and thankfully cricket is the one thing that's, I think it's the second most documented thing on the internet, apart from pornography. If you want to look at a match played in 1983 between Nigambo and Kandy, the whole score sheet is there with photographs. And so, yeah, I spent 2 years, I would say 6 months before I started writing, but while I was writing, I was still watching cricket matches. I didn't watch contemporary stuff, so I stopped watching I stopped following cricket, but I looked at that period. But also I was writing from a point of view of two men in their 60s, and I was in my 30s at the time. So I wanted to sort of imbue their way of speaking, and so I'd interview all my uncles, and I'd go to these bars in the afternoon where these old men, retirees, would come. They just placed a bet on the horses and won or lost, and they'd be having a drink. And I'd sit with them and I'd talk to them about cricket. Old men in Sri Lanka love to talk about cricket. I think old men in Kerala probably the same. But while they were talking about cricket, I was also watching their mannerisms, the words they'd use, and also their relationships with their wives, who they'd talk about surreptitiously. And so, yeah, so that was fun research. I mean, I had to research corpses and
that is something very admirable, the amount of research you do for your books.
I think it's a bit of paranoia as well, because you feel when you're writing, and I feel this when my day job was in advertising, and I feel like I can't come up with the idea unless I know as much as I can about the subject. So even in advertising, you read the brief, and if you're doing milk powder, you kind of immerse yourself for a couple of days. I guess with a novel, it's different. But I feel I need to fill up, and I write with pencil on A3 sheets. I need to fill up as many sheets as possible with scribbles before I start typing. I guess because the blank page is a terrifying place. So I end up probably doing too much research. A lot of the stuff, for 7 Moons, I visited haunted houses, visited clairvoyants, people who see ghosts, and I didn't see a ghost myself, but watched horror movies. I don't know if all of that was useful, but then after a point you think, okay, I know as much as I need to know. You just need to know enough that you can lie convincingly. I'm not writing nonfiction, I'm not writing documentary. So I just needed enough that I could make up a story. But yeah, I think now I'm in the research phase of a 3rd novel, and it's my favorite part because there's no pressure. You can just go on tangents and go wherever your interest takes you. But yeah, after about a year of that, you probably have enough notes to construct a plot and character. But yeah, it's definitely a crucial part of the process, because if I go in blind and I try and write something, it comes out fake, or I feel it comes out inauthentic. So I think it's essential.
Would you like to read from Chinaman?
Yeah, sure. From Chinaman, yes. Because I've been reading a lot from 7 Moons. I'll read a little bit from Chinaman. So Chinaman, I wanted to write a book that didn't mention politics at all, just mentioned cricket and left arm spin. But there is one passage that mentions politics. I'll give you a bit of context. WG and Ari, the protagonists, used to watch cricket at their friend Johnny, who was an Englishman who had a big house with a big screen TV and a satellite dish and could watch the live matches. But Johnny gets in trouble with some of the villagers who break into his house and they shit in his swimming pool. So this WG looks at these brown things floating in this beautiful pool and he thinks about Sri Lankan ethnic conflict, as you do. So this one is called Shades of Brown. I was watching football with Johnny. This is a long time before allegations or excrement in pools. He's cursing people from Manchester, a city just a few hours' drive from his own. I ask him what the difference between a Geordie and a Mancunian is, and he starts explaining the accents, both of which I find equally incomprehensible. I ask him how many accents his little island has, and he demonstrates through famous sportsmen. He begins in Scotland with Kenny Dalglish, takes me through the northeast via Messrs. Boycott, Truman, and Brian Clough. Then we visit Atherton's Manchester, the Midlands courtesy of Mansell, and end up in the east of London with Phil Tufnell. By the time he takes me to Wales via the great Gareth Edwards, my stomach aches from laughter, but I am amazed. One island, 3 nations, countless accents, but one united race. This is before Brexit, I wrote this, by the way. The race of Britons united long enough to rule the world, at least for a while. As much as Kevin Keegan hates Alex Ferguson, he doesn't refer to him as belonging to a different species. But sadly in Sri Lanka, that is exactly what we do. It is race and religion first, country last. Okay then, laddie, explain the differences between Sinhalese and Tamils to me, asked Johnny. And I am stumped. I could start with the stereotypes. Sinhalese are lazy, gullible bullies. Tamils are shrewd, organized brown-nosers. Tamils have moustaches and chalk on their foreheads. Sinhalese are less dark, but not as fair as the Muslims or the Burghers. The Sinhala language is sing-songy. Tamil is more guttural. Tamil names end in consonants, Sinhalese in vowels. Tamils are Hindu, Sinhalese are Buddhist. Tamils mispronounce the word Baldia. Sinhalese eat cow and don't like people getting ahead unless it is them. But all this tells you nothing. I can introduce you to a fair-skinned Tamil who speaks perfect Sinhala and follows the teachings of Christ and his mother. Or take you to a Tamil place that ends in vowels, where you may meet a Sinhalese doctor named Karya Vasam. Sri Lanka is filled with many shades of brown, not unlike the stuff that ended up in Johnny's pool. It is not so much the colors as the ideas that these colors spawn that I find objectionable. The united super race of Britons may have started it all when they, among other things, segregated our cricket clubs. Though it is perhaps unfair and inaccurate to lay the blame for our racial problems on the streets of Downing or the palaces of Buckingham. Despite the existence of the Sinhalese Sports Club, a Tamil Union, a Moors Sports Club, a Burgher Recreation Club, and a perversely christened nondescript cricket club, cricket as a sport refused to be segregated. Clubs grabbed talent regardless of vowels or consonants or moustaches or chalk. So much for divide and conquer. By the 1950s, we began to develop our own dangerous ideas without any foreign assistance. The idea that the nation belongs to the Sinhala, or that the Tamil deserves a separate state. Ideas that have clashed and exploded for the last 30 years. Perhaps one day they will be replaced by an idea of Sri Lankanness that welcomes all shades of brown, though I suspect my generation will have to die to give birth to it. India got independence a year before us. They are larger, more diverse, and more excitable than us Ceylonese, but still embrace the idea of India above being a Bengali, a Sikh, or a Muslim, something we have been incapable of doing. We are smaller in every way, and we are smaller-minded. If I had to explain it, I would adopt the approach of the famous divide and conquer man, Mr. Rudyard Kipling. Sinhalese are sloth bears, lethargic, cuddly creatures of modest brain who will break things if riled. Tamils are carrion crows, resourceful creatures, resilient and peaceful unless provoked. Forget this nonsense of lions and tigers, neither of which have lived in Sri Lanka for over a millennium. But then I look closely at the shades of brown and I see interlocking patterns. The Tamil Zion is called Elam, which derives from the same Sanskrit word as Hela, the Sinhala word for sovereignty. Men from both races gobble rice and acquire bellies at middle age. Women of both races oil their hair and spread malicious gossip. Both races can be equally feudal, equally cruel, and equally capable of turning on their own. Both can be proud to the point of stupidity. Explain the differences between Sinhalese and Tamils? I cannot. The truth is, whatever differences there may be, they are not large enough to burn down libraries, blow up banks, and send children onto minefields. They are not significant enough to waste hundreds of months firing millions of bullets into thousands of bodies. Thank you.
Now speaking about Tamils and Sinhala, this question of their strife, there is this very short story called Easy Tiger. The whole story is written in the form of text message between a husband and wife, Jagan and Suli. Jagan is a Tamil and she is Sinhala. And here Jagan is using or using this victim card of being a Tamil in order to cover up his numerous flings. So that is one aspect you have written in a very humorous manner about the serious question. And when we come to Seven Moons of Almeida, Rani was killed for being a moderate by the LTT. So that was another aspect. So would you like to talk about that?
So Easy Tiger was a bit of a silly story. I want to see if I could write a story purely from text messages between a husband and wife fighting. And it was also based on a true story. I know one guy in my office in the ad agency, his wife caught him cheating, and he said, okay, I'm going to go and join the LTT. And then he got on a bus and he goes, and then the wife said, no, please come back, don't do that. And yeah, typical playing the victim card. I don't know if they're still married or not, but I just found that a very amusing story, that this guy who's been caught cheating on his wife is going to now resort to this to get out of a woman's scorn. He probably thought the tigers were safer than a woman's scorn. So I wrote that story, but of course the story is light-hearted and it's got a few twists in it as well. But the Rani Sridharan, who is based on Dr. Rajini Thiranagama, and this is the thing that Mali notes it in Seven Moons, is that all these causes, the JVP, who are still a political force now, it all starts with worthy causes. The Tamil people certainly had a right to demand a separate state and to become militant because they had been pushed since the 50s towards this. And it seemed a worthy cause, as did the JVP trying to fight for the working class Sri Lankans or the university graduates who couldn't get jobs. But what tended to happen with both these organizations is after they get powerful, they become fascists. They end up trying to silence the other voices. They want to be the only voice. So if there's a Tamil moderate who's advocating not militancy, that there is another system. And so a whole generation of Tamil moderates were murdered during that. And I think that's when, again, the Tamil people also started to turn against the LTT, because suddenly, are you representing us or are you representing your own mutated cause? And so, yeah, so Rani Sridharan, the fact that she wrote The Broken Palmyra, which is a seminal book and it was written in 1989, where she was outlining all the atrocities and talking about the fact that the government and the LTT have been responsible for killing Sri Lankans, and she paid for that with her life. But there was a postscript to that so I based, like Mali Almeida is not Richard de Soisa. Dr. Rani, I don't think she's Rajini Thiranagama, I just based it on her character. But her daughters, who were 8 and 10 when she was killed, and who are now, they moved to the UK, they read the book and they tweeted about it, and Narmada Thiranagama wrote an article about it saying, and it's quite, it chokes me up a bit because it's quite moving. She said, it's such a gift to be able to see my mother alive again. And Shehan's never met my mother, but she's just as bossy and just as caring as she was. And I had no way of knowing this. But that was a wonderful bit, and I've since connected with the daughters and I've spoken to them, and I hope to meet them someday. But yeah, I mean, the pain is still with them. They were so young when this happened, and their mother was such a towering figure and such a benevolent figure, and that loss is still with them. And so they thanked me for saying that I got to, and they even said I went to sleep and I dreamt of my mom after I read the book, and this is powerful. I mean, this is the best feedback you can get. But answer to your question is, this is again the real problem of Sri Lanka. Even in the early 90s, we wiped out an entire generation of leaders. You know, the Sinhala leaders were, and these murders are not solved. They say it was, yeah, it's easy. You blame it on the Tigers or the JVP or the government, and they are not solved. But we wiped out a whole generation of moderate leaders. So we're left with the idiots and the radicals. And I think that seems to be the legacy that we're now reaping and suffering from.
One unique characteristic of your writing is how you employ humor and wit, even when you are dealing with heavy themes. So, does it make is it writing more easier or difficult?
So it's not like I write the thing serious and then I inject a dose of humor into it. It doesn't work that way. I suppose I pick narrators that I can hide behind, and the narrators are generally, so W.G. Karunatilaka is a typical drunken uncle, Sri Lankan uncle obsessed with cricket, and those guys they're irritating if they've had too much to drink, but they're also very entertaining guys if you catch them after, the first 2 drinks. They have lots of stories, and when a drunk uncle tells you a story, he'll start here and then go all the way around here, but if you stay with them, they finally come to the point. And that was the model I was using and you spend so much time doing the research and in this voice that you end up mimicking their rhythms and patterns. And Chinaman's essentially about a guy who's done nothing with his life, drinking himself to death. So it should be a very depressing story, but he sees the absurdity and the humor in the choices he's made. So I guess that's where that came from. With Mali Almeida, he was a closet queen, very snarky, very sarcastic, and very scathing of the Colombo bubble, and also very irritated by he deals with all the sides, and he realizes there aren't any good guys in this war. They're just different degrees of bad guys. So yeah, so I think absurdity is the common thread. They are both, Sri Lankan cricket is absurd, Sri Lanka's wars are absurd, and both these narrators see the humor in that. So that's how I approach it. I didn't set out to write a funny book about corpses, but I think I fall in love with the voice when I'm writing, and then I just pursue that. But it is a fine line, because you can joke about drunks and cricketers, but when you're joking about serious stuff, you don't want to seem to trivialize it, which I don't think he does. I think he's well aware of how grim the situation is, but this gallows humor is also a very Sri Lankan thing. I mean, even during, even after the tsunami, people were cracking jokes about tsunamis, which was very distasteful, but people are cracking jokes about the economic crisis and mocking the leaders. And even when we didn't have petrol, we didn't have gas, food was expensive, the internet, they couldn't switch it off. They tried, but they couldn't, and the jokes on the internet just kept flowing. Cartoons, memes, just answering when politician makes a statement, people give back to them. So I think Sri Lanka, we like laughing at each other. Maybe not laughing at ourselves, but laughing at each other. And maybe that's a survival mechanism as well. So it all seemed to work together. And like I've said before, we either laugh at each other, or we start punching each other, or start killing each other. So I think it's better to crack jokes and wait peacefully. And so I think that's where it came from. But also I enjoyed writing, because when you're writing about such depressing subjects, you're going to get depressed as well. And really, if you go to the real history of '89, the facts are far more gruesome than anything that I've written. So I think humor, it's a mechanism, it's a coping mechanism, it's a device, but it's also a powerful weapon, I think, because humor can bring down tyrants as well.
Now, apart from this novels and collection of short story, you write for children also.
Yes,
and you have written for a documentary, you have scripted a movie called 800, based
Yes.
on Muralidharan's life. So it's your is so very different. I mean, vastly. So what?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's that different. So the documentary that we're trying to get made is about 1996, about the World Cup. And I'm writing with Andrew Fidel Fernando, fantastic cricket writer who has followed Sri Lanka losing for the last 10 years. But I don't watch the cricket matches, but I read his articles because he finds something funny or insightful or sad to write about when Sri Lanka's lost by an innings to Afghanistan. He can find some sort of humor in that. And so that's the documentary. The movie was 800 about Muttaya Muralidharan. I don't think these are different. Like, I suppose when I was working in advertising, you have to write radio spots, TV, commercials, print ads. Now you got to write TikToks and all that. You're still using words in different mediums. And you're still telling a story and trying to engage a reader or an audience. So I don't see any big contradiction. And it's the same process. I got into kids' books just because I had children while writing Seven Moons, and they made writing Seven Moons quite difficult. I mean, now they are 9 and 6, so they're better behaved, but they were once 1 and 3, and anyone who's had children knows it's tough to write magic realist books about dead photographers when you have like kids shouting and banging on your door. So then I thought, I might write some books for them, and that's what I set up Papaya Books and wrote some children's books. But I don't think it's a contradiction. I think you employ the same tools. You still research and you just use it for the different medium. I'd like to write a video game one of these days. I wait till my kids become teenagers so I can start playing video games with them. And so they are a great target audience now. So now I'm writing kids' books. I probably write young adults' books when they get a bit older, and let's see. But it's good to have multiple things to do. I think if you have one thing to do, you end up making lots of cups of tea and cleaning your room and watching YouTube. If you have 5 things to do, you'll at least do 2 of them. So that's why I kind of try to do that and keep myself busy.
There is this gap of almost 10 years between the 2 novels. And in one of your interviews, you said that your kids were small as one of the reasons for.
Yeah, I blamed it on the kids. Yeah, for sure. They're not here.
I found it very interesting to hear that from a man. As a woman, I could relate to that very easily. So.
No, my wife isn't writing many novels either. She bears the brunt of it. Make no mistake. I'm just a supporting actor in that. But yeah. But the first few years, I mean, yeah, my daughter was born in 2014. Around the time I was researching and writing what was Devil Dance. It wasn't Seven Moons. And, unfair to blame the kids, but you know what it's like, right? It's, the house is chaos, you're shouting at each other, you're trying to concentrate, and you get like 15 minutes to write before someone starts screaming, and yeah. So, but also I think the story was complicated. It may have needed a few drafts to happen, but they are much better behaved now. And now we can pack them off to school, so we get 4 hours of writing time, and so yeah, hopefully things get better. I'm waiting till they become teenagers and they don't want to talk to me. Then I'll probably write a lot more novels. But yeah, it is whatever. But I'm grateful for. I thought it would be a bad idea to have children. I thought would you rather have 2 children or write 5 books? But I think you can have it all. It is a blessing.